Mhm. Hi there.
Hi, how are you?
Doing very well. How are you?
I'm good. Good. Been busy.
Goodness.
Seems strange to be as busy. All of a
Right?
sudden, back to doing normal stuff.
This used to be normal. That's right.
Yeah.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Oh,
Hello.
So did you get a haircut, John?
It's been a while, but yeah,
The whole different styling there looks good.
it's kind of just been the same since a long time, just shorter or longer.
Well, we just
Uh,
watched the bald spot, so
yeah. I am one of the Dalia cousins who didn't get bald spots. That's
well, you know who the bald spots are, though, right?
I
John?
do.
All right.
Yes. I'm an
Very
almost
important.
I'm planned to be a groupie.
oh good.
Yeah. Yes, definitely.
What a gorgeous day it is out there.
Mhm.
You know, you wonder why my faith goes up and down like a yo-yo. I came to Bible study last Thursday instead of watching the Arizona game.
Wow.
Yeah,
Boy,
and look what happened.
I won't tell them if you won't.
What happened?
They lost. They went home. Although tomorrow, is it tomorrow? No, Saturday is just a game for the ages. Duke and North Carolina, who've never played in the tournament before. My goodness.
Well,
It's gonna be pretty tense over here, just saying.
Yeah, of course.
You can come
My-
stay at our house, Susan.
Yeah, I might do that. And then if Duke loses, I don't think I can come back home for a while.
Yeah. I don't know if this is interesting to many of you, but this is a book I recommend. I like it so much I lent it out and then had to buy a new copy. It just came. It's called How to Read a Church: A Guide to the Symbols and Images in Churches and Cathedrals. So many of the old cathedrals are written for a pre-literate audience. And so the things that are on the walls and the ways that they're carved, they all say something to people who understand that language. And I've been in a lot of cathedrals. I don't think I understood everything that was going on in all of them.
You know who years ago did a great study on architecture in churches was
Kurt
Illingworth.
Illingworth, yeah.
He did it. It was really, that was a long time ago, but really
Yeah.
very well done.
Yeah.
for Sunday school.
Yeah.
I talked to him a little bit during the pandemic, and it's a long list of folks who said it'd be nice to do something when this all ends.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, he wrote a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe in the middle.
oh, really?
Yeah, and it was a pilgrim's hitchhiking
Yeah.
at time.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting, and it's a good book.
Well, I think a lot of you know that I did one of the Camino de Santiago, one of the Santiago routes in 2019. We started in Porto on the coast of Portugal and walked up Portugal and into Spain and all the way up to Santiago, where legend has it as James, the brother of Jesus, is buried. And it has been a pilgrimage site for, my gosh, maybe 1,000 years or so. This year we're going to do walk in the footsteps of Saint Francis between Florence and Assisi, and can't wait.
That'll be beautiful.
Mhm.
Are they letting people back into the Assisi church?
I'm not
Yeah.
sure yet. I think there's part of it that's open and part of it that's still being repaired. I think there was an earthquake there a few years ago that
Yeah.
did a lot of damage, and so we haven't checked into that part yet. But the walking, once you get past the first few days of soreness, is actually it's pretty good. For people like myself who struggle with the contemplative side of our faith, somehow putting your body in pain a little bit, sort of a constant low grade pain, like exercise pain,
I don't know what that's like.
takes my brain, shuts my brain down, and lets me be, I think, a little bit more open to reflection and God's voice. And so looking forward to that.
Hey, John, can I ask
Sure.
you a question?
Yeah.
That guy Bob that's on a lot, I don't see him today, but I always like his comments. What did he do before he retired?
I think he is still the CEO of a foundation. I think it's called Harvest Foundation.
Something like that.
If you look up his name, Robert Moffat and Foundation, you'll probably get it. I don't want to do it while I'm here. I'll lose all of you. But he runs a charitable foundation that does, I think, relief and development work in Africa.
Oh, and how did he get involved with joining us?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we knew his. Oh no, I think he may be somebody that emailed me saying they were moving into the area and were looking for a church. I think that's right. And they live in Santa Maria. They've been in person with us a couple of times, but for the most part, they join us on the electronically.
Well, wonderful.
Yeah. A couple more people trickling in. I am going to try and make somebody a co-host, because when I am the only host and I let somebody in, I have my notes here on the screen and I lose them every time. And I find that to be distracting. So
Luann should be your co-host.
you think?
Oh,
That much.
no, Kathy knows what she's doing.
No, Margot.
No, them.
I hear
I
you
don't
all
think-
saying, please let this cup pass from me.
I think you have to have a certain type of membership in order to do that. Don't you?
That's right.
Probably.
So Margot definitely has that.
Ah,
So is
thank
that
you,
going to be
Kathy.
elder or deacon status in order to be co-hosts?
See, on mine, it only says make host. It doesn't say make co-host. And I'm going to show some slides. So I still want to be the host. Anyway, this is a conundrum, but I'm going to learn to live with it, and it's going to be fine for tonight. Let me mute you all, and let's begin with prayer. You want to grab it? Let's pray together. God, we thank you for bringing us together. We thank you for the longer days and the sunshine, and for the opportunities to reflect during this season of Lent. May this be a meaningful season for all of us. And tonight, as we consider the virtue of temperance, be with us and continue to shape us. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. So I'm not going to do the full intro, because I think as I look around, most of you have heard it multiple times. I'll do a little bit, but I want to say that because I think the word virtue actually has some value for us as a framing device for this. We're looking at virtues. We're looking at what were some older virtues, and then the ways that they have been folded into the life, the Christian life. And but even just the word virtue, it comes from the Latin word for human. And so what we learned from that, kind of reverse engineering the word a little bit, is that it refers to life as it's meant to be lived. The virtuous life is the life that is as God intended for us to live. And so each week we've been looking at a virtue and what it means, and we've been looking at what the Bible says about it, and maybe what the church has said over time. That's certainly the case for this one. And my hope is, over these past few weeks, as we've looked at prudence and justice and fortitude, is that those have been valuable things for you to reflect on during this Lenten season. The four basic virtues, and we're doing the fourth one tonight, those predate our theology. Four of those virtues predate Judaism and Christianity, and then it contains three that Christians added later. We're going to do all three of those in the same time next week, because they're all part of the same text in the Bible. So the four original ones, as I said, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And then the Christian faith takes over the discussion and adds faith, hope, and charity, or love. And those seven virtues are meant to define what life is supposed to be like, how we're called and made to live. And so tonight we're talking about temperance, and it, on the one hand, it's exactly what you think, and on the other, it may not be what you think. Several writers that I looked at, and all the way back into classical times, thought that temperance was the foundational virtue, that virtually, that's not what I meant, that all of the other virtues stem out of the capacity to live a life that is temperate. And so that's a little bit of what we'll look at tonight. So typically, I've been looking at dictionary definitions to start, and the definition of temperance is a little bit helpful. It's moderation in action, thought, or feeling. Overall, it is the capacity for restraint. And a second definition is habitual moderation in the indulgence of the appetites or passions. Now, we don't spend a lot of time talking about appetites and passions here, but temperance is our capacity to show restraint in the way that we indulge our appetites or passions. And so these are general, these are not necessarily tied to Christian faith or theology or the Bible, but they are, these are virtues. That's a virtue that predates all of our own religious thought. As we get to biblical definitions, it includes things like emotional restraint, and then really, and we're going to end with this later on this evening, essentially it is the capacity and the virtue of self-control. So the ability to rein ourselves in, and some of that we've seen in the other virtues too, but really in temperance, reining in our own selves and demonstrating self-control is the definition. And so that helps us get a little play. I was looking at something because the word to temper something is interesting to me. And so, of course, I looked it up. Now, as an English major, I know what all the words mean. I'm not 100% sure I know the science of this, but tempering, when you're talking about metal, tempering is a process of heat treating, which is used to increase the toughness of iron-based alloys. So in other words, the things that are iron-based, and I think iron-based would include steel, it would include maybe tin as we know it or experience it, and a half a dozen maybe other prominent metals that are in our life. Tempering is this process that makes them harder and more resistant. It increases their toughness. I just kind of like that as a way of a side door into talking about temperance. The other thing is that most of us who've driven cars for a long time, if you look at your windshield, somewhere on there, it probably says tempered glass. tempered glass. It's a type of safety glass that is processed by controlled thermal or chemical treatments to increase its strength compared with normal glass. Get this, tempering, when you talk about glass, tempering glass puts the outer surfaces into compression and the interior surface into tension. Now, I'm a preacher, so I think if I were preaching that passage or preaching a passage about temperance, I would make use of that, putting the outer surfaces into compression, holding them back, and the interior into tension, using some sort of our own strength and capacity and God's help to keep ourselves in check. But anyway, that's as much science as I'm going to do tonight. That sounded interesting to me. The virtue of temperance is really about moderation and self-control. It describes taking care in decisions and restraining any of our leanings toward bad behavior or unnecessary risk. Maybe that is what appetites and passions lead to: bad behavior and unnecessary risk. That might be a tangent for another evening. But in a sense, it's a lot like prudence, as we talked about in the very first week. It's that capacity to pause and wait and to make the right measured decision and not just do whatever comes to us. And I think we had a pretty interesting discussion that first week about, does prudence limit spontaneity? And maybe it does a little, but I think those are two different things. I think spontaneity still works, and prudence or temperance tonight is really taking care in restraining our leanings toward bad behavior or unnecessary risk. Like the other virtues, and like we've been talking about over these past few weeks, temperance has an internal focus and an external focus. Internally, temperance is meant to keep us healthy and safe, to keep us focused on God and our relationship with God, to keep us focused on our own limits. That it's a great line from a Clint Eastwood Western where he says, a man's got to know his limitations. And there is something about that self-awareness that feeds into the internal side of temperance. But externally, in other words, all of this is kind of bracketed by love God and love neighbor. But externally, temperance recognizes that our individual behaviors and decisions have an impact on the community around us. And so that got me thinking about the glass. And I don't know where to go with this, but just hear this line again from the definition of tempered glass. Tempering puts the outer surfaces into compression and the interior surfaces into tension. We may come back and look at this internal, external thing as we look at the Bible passages in a moment. But for now, temperance allows me to sort of swing into my comfort zone and talk a little bit about the history of temperance as we know it, as we think about it. Temperance has come to mean the call to abstain from drinking alcohol. Here's the interesting thing. From the actual times of the Bible until the late 18th century, that is, for about 1800 years of Christian faith, drinking alcohol was considered a normal and healthy part of life. Drunkenness is not acceptable even in the Bible, but drinking in moderation wasn't considered a social sin until the late 1700s. And this is where the history that happens beyond the walls of the church actually helps us understand what's going on. It was the Industrial Revolution that led to the call to reduce the use of alcohol. And all of this was a part of the massive social change that happened in Britain and America first, and in other countries later, as our country moved from farming to heavy industry. factories had regular hours. Even if you edged up to the top level of moderate alcohol use, that might not make you punctual for getting to work. And absenteeism impacted profits in a factory setting in a way that it might not have on a farm. And then this one may be the key one: manufacturing machinery posed dangers to people. And factory owners and managers learned pretty early that sober employees either didn't make something incorrect or hurt themselves or other people with machinery. And so all of this is happening in the 1700s, in the 18th century. And alongside this concentration of labor in factories, the Industrial Revolution logically caused a massive migration from farms to cities, from rural areas to cities. And this whole process leads to an irony about alcohol consumption in Britain and America. And this one, we want to look back. The Industrial Revolution, for most of us, when we took our history classes, is presented as this great leap forward in human progress. And there's a lot of ways where it is. But the labor conditions in factories, especially in the first century after the Industrial Revolution, the labor conditions in factories, the ones that made alcohol impairment dangerous, those conditions dehumanized life and made drunkenness an escape. And so the irony is that it's more dangerous for you and less productive to have consumed too much alcohol if you were going to work in a factory. But on the other hand, working in a factory oftentimes made people want to self-medicate with alcohol. Factories in the first century of the Industrial Revolution, and even afterwards, they were brutal places to work. Workers didn't have protections. Injuries and work-related deaths were common. There was little job security. For men and women who moved from farms or rural settings into cities and factories and sweatshops, it was the work itself that made alcohol abuse appealing. And so 100 years into the 100 years into the Industrial Revolution, this was a political or this was a comic that was published as a way of showing the dangers of alcohol. This is a play on Pilgrim's Progress. This is called Drunkard's Progress. And if it's not big enough to read, I'm going to read it for you. But step one is a glass with a friend. And the step two is a glass to keep the cold out. And then step three is a glass too much. And you can already see the impairment on the man's face there with the maroon or purple tie. Step four, drunk and riotous. So we've gone right from one glass too much to drunk and riotous in one step. Step five up there at the top, the summit attained, jolly companions, and a person is a confirmed drunkard. And then the downslope on the other side, step six, poverty and disease. Step seven, forsaken by friends. Step eight, desperation and crime. And then step nine, death by suicide. It is in the way that preachy cartoons were during this era. It is stark, right? It's overstated. It's meant to get your attention and get a point. But look down here under the bridge. The wife and child are left alone, are left destitute here. And again, the caption is "The Drunkard's Progress from the First Glass to the Grave." So that's just one example. There were literally hundreds to choose from. That one had a nice sort of poetic sweep to it, and so that's the one that I used. But factories were brutal places. They were dehumanizing places to work until society developed an equilibrium to provide a good whole life for people who worked in manufacturing. It was basically moving from day subsistence on the farm, and you grow what you eat, to entering into this horrible coal smoke choked factory and working 10 hours a day for 6 or 7 days a week with little pay and no protection. And so what I'm trying to get at is no wonder they drank. And so incidentally, during this period, one of the evangelists we talked about in the evangelicalism class, Dwight Moody, one of the side unintended consequences of this dehumanization in urban industrial life is that men did not go to church anymore. Men went in, it's sort of like somebody who has lived either homeless or lived somehow lost on an island. Think of Tom Hanks at the end of that movie where he's lived on that island for such a long time. He would not be fit to walk into a building where other well-bathed people were. At least that would be the perception. Imagine a whole class of working men who felt that way about themselves. And Moody talked about making the church receptive and a safe space for men, because it had become, at that time, completely like a Victorian women's gathering. And so part of Moody's evangelism was to go out and talk to at that time, working men who were not coming to church and try and make the church accessible for them. Anyway, this urbanization and turn to factories has a huge impact on our world that I think we still feel every so often. Most of my family were, on one side, rabidly anti-union, but I don't think they ever really considered what unions brought to the people who worked there. On the Italian side, my grandfather was part of the union as an auto worker, and it gave him not only a life that he could provide for the 3 of his 4 kids that survived World War II, but also a pension that he still cashed when I knew him, right up until the day that he died, right up until the day my grandmother died 10 years after he did. So, and the union gave him that. So none of that existed here. And what you have is a really huge problem with the abuse of alcohol during the early days of the Industrial Revolution. In Great Britain, in the first half of the 1700s, they had a problem that was known as the gin craze. Gin was an unregulated alcohol that could be made anywhere. It was meant to drink fast, to get drunk quickly. It was cheaply available everywhere. Parliament, the British Parliament passed 5 major laws between 1729 and 1751. So a span of 22 years just to control gin and its availability to the masses. Farther north, in the more dour part of the country, in Scotland, you have the Church of Scotland, but then you have this split off group that is far more conservative than the Church of Scotland ever was, called the Free Church of Scotland. And not for nothing, there's a split off from the Free Church of Scotland that is literally called the Wee Free Church of Scotland, the little Free Church of Scotland. But in the Free Church of Scotland, they issued a report on drunkenness in 1869. And it said this about drunkenness, that it was, quote, a sin against God. It differs from every other sin and exceeds them all in its direful effects. for it is the only sin which is the direct voluntary extinction of reason. It is the main cause of poverty, crime, insanity, ignorance, and numerous other evils. This was issued by, a denominational publication. Hard to imagine the PCUSA coming out with that one right now. But this was a huge issue, and churches were trying to address it. Oftentimes, as churches do, they may have gone a little bit too far. In the early 1800s in America, the first of what we call temperance organizations started to try to encourage more moderate drinking and not outright bans. The funny thing is that those movements collapsed within a few years. They were not successful. Also in the 1800s in America, in the later part of the century, you have the Anti-Saloon League. These are worth looking up sometime. And maybe one that's more familiar to you, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. These became nationally known groups that were influential in the decades leading up to the passage of the Volstead Act. For those of you who remember your history classes, the Volstead Act becomes the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. We know it as prohibition. Incidentally, over 1918 and 1919. So think about where we are historically. This is, we have just mobilized a draft army for the first time since the Civil War, sent them to Europe for a year. 90,000 of them were killed. And the army comes back, and this is the time when they decide we can't have these young men coming back and falling into drunkenness while we find a place for them. And so over 1918 and 1919, for those, remember your civics classes, in order to get an amendment to the Constitution ratified, Congress has to approve it, has to pass the law, and then it has to be passed by 2/3 of the states. 46 of the 48 states voted in favor of prohibition over 1918 and 1919. And prohibition began in 1920. I know you're curious. So it's Connecticut and Rhode Island that voted against prohibition. Got any Connecticut's or Rhode Islanders here? I can't tell. So this is, prohibition starts in 1920. It was a law that was led by religious groups thinking this was going to make society better. Most of you will know that prohibition was a dismal failure. It sparked the massive growth of organized crime in America. You've probably seen either the movie The Untouchables, or if you're lucky, you saw the old television show, The Untouchables, with Elliot Ness. Trying to remember the actor's name who played him. Somebody can tell me when you're not muted. Or any other movie or TV show about the ways organized crime got rich off of illegal alcohol. Al Capone by himself was said to have made $80 million in 1927. Almost all of that on bootlegging. By the time prohibition was repealed in 1933, which was incidentally the worst year of the Depression, nearly 35% unemployment in the US in 1933. Bootlegging was common, smuggling was even more so, and the Irish and Italian gangs that had engaged in small crimes before 1920 were now well-funded by illegal alcohol and earning off of construction and drugs and the corruption of labor unions. Prohibition is a poor reflection on the virtue of temperance. If we think back to the definitions that we looked at in the beginning, I think we get a better understanding of what temperance means. Remember the dictionary definitions: moderation in action, thought, or feeling, with restraint in capital letters. and habitual moderation in the indulgence of the appetites or passions. And then in a more biblical sense, emotional restraint or the virtue of self-control, which really is another way to say temperance. The key that we're going to see in biblical passages, and also I think what we understand just by common sense, is that moderation is the key. And I think that's what we're going to see in these Bible verses as we look at them. We'll see both the internal and the external expressions of the virtue of temperance. In Proverbs 25, verses 16 and 17, there's two examples. You know, Proverbs tends to give you a line, and then it gives you another line that's meant to be like the balancing, equal, equivalent line. But these two kind of made me laugh today, and I thought they were worth sharing. The first, so this is verses 16 and 17 in Proverbs 25. If you find honey, eat just enough. Too much of it, and you will vomit. And then the parallel equivalent is seldom set foot in your neighbor's house. Too much of you, and they will hate you. So I don't know how we get from honey and vomit to not being too persistent a house guest at your neighbor's house, but there you are. But the point there is, it doesn't say if you find honey, run away. It says eat enough honey. And it doesn't say never go into your neighbor's house. It says do that in moderation. Too much of you, and they will hate you. So moderation is what we're going to see in these passages as we look at them, as we do this part of the study. In 1 Corinthians 6:12, Paul writes, I have the right to do anything you say. He's caricaturing an opinion that he has heard. I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. So let me read that. I think I made that not make sense. The first sentence is him caricaturing another view. And then the second sentence is Paul talking as himself, the way he approaches this. So the caricature is, I have the right to do anything. But he adds, not everything is beneficial. And then Paul says, I have the right to do anything. I am free to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. And so, again, moderation is an easy way to prevent addiction, unless there's a clinical cause, but it's an easy, or it's an easier way to avoid dependence on something. And so, in other words, I have the right to do anything isn't as important as knowing what not to do. Again, it's a moderation thing. Where that first one about not eating too much honey is about maintaining our own internal health. The one about the neighbor's house is about the external side of this. The Corinthians passage is, I have the right to do anything. I am free as a person. And, you know, all of us have heard this argument over the last 2 years when it comes to masks and vaccines. Nobody can tell me to do that. Well, maybe not, but it's still the best thing to do. And a moderate, temperate person figures that out. That's the virtue. Being able to look at something and saying, well, I have a right to do these other 8 things, but it's this one that's the best thing for me to do. And then in James, again, this is the more relational side. James, in the first chapter, verses 19 and 20, James writes, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. How different would our world be if we could just hang on to that one verse, quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. My sense is that certainly our social media interactions would have been a lot different over the last 10 years. Certainly some of our family gatherings would have been different. Slow, quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. The reason these are important, and the reason I'm saving this one for last, in Paul's letter to the Galatians, which is a letter that is trying to encourage a group of Christians not to feel as though they have to embrace the whole Jewish law in order to become followers of Jesus. And in the end, after he's dismantling this idea that we have to become faithful Jews before we can become faithful Christians, he says in the 5th chapter of Galatians, verses 22 to 25, you will know these passages. He says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and temperance, or self-control. And then just to add a little oomph to the argument he's making, he says, against such things there is no law. Those who belong in Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. We hear that passions and appetites again. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. And so this virtue of temperance, of self-control, of learning to live in moderation, of showing restraint, of choosing the best thing, not just everything we're allowed to do, is essential. It's essential to growing into that full, whole life that God offers us as disciples of his Son. And so I think that's where I want to end it and take us into discussion. Temperance, a lot more interesting than just waving a flag saying don't drink. But it is sometimes that also. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah.
So I see Anna put her little hand icon up. Anna, please.
Such a cute little icon. You may already have said this, but I just want to emphasize, based on the experiences of my family and friends, that is to say, some of my family and some of my friends, the nature of alcohol and some other substances, they're so addictive that even if you want to be doing things in moderation,
Of course,
it's not necessarily possible to be moderate unless you're getting a lot of support, like from counselors or 12-step groups or whatever.
Yeah, that's very important. I tried to hint at that with saying, that sometimes there are clinical reasons where this doesn't work, but yeah, that's a great point. And I have, family members who've had that struggle. Our own son-in-law who struggled with substance abuse ended up taking his own life.
Oh.
And so it's, I know that it is a serious issue. And it's one of the reasons why alcohol is probably the worst example to use in talking about temperance. What if we, instead of alcohol, had a campaign against angry, abusive speech? I'd go to that meeting. I think a lot of church people who've been around the block a few times would go to that meeting. And so, yeah, it's not a great example. Thanks for that, Anna. It's overall the idea of moderation, even in food. Let's put it on. Let's switch it from drink to food.
Okay.
Gluttony shows up in both testaments. Clearly, it was recognized even in the Bronze Age as a problem when people ate too much. For those of you who were with us during the Amos study, remember the whole idea of eating your fill when you weren't hungry anymore while other people was starving was something that got under God's skin. And so again, moderation, looking and showing some restraint is what temperance calls for. Susan, please.
I think the other thing that's so conflictual in our society is that there's such a preponderance of movies where violence is extreme and the way people talk to each other is extreme, and to then say to people, moderation. And I didn't see it, but I understand the Oscars had an expression of that, the
It did.
lack of moderation.
Yeah. Lack of
that
restraint.
grew out of, critical humor,
Yeah.
which wasn't perceived as humorous by the recipient. And anyway, I just think it's a message that Christians, the only way to preach it is to live it and then encourage others to live it also, because
That's exactly
there's,
right.
there's too many people out there who love that. And I think the exposure makes it so easy then to go to the extreme.
Yeah. I'm in movies and things, where I thought you were going is something that I noticed. I watch a lot of old movies. I was watching a movie with Humphrey Bogart, which is actually it's not a gangster movie. It's called In a Lonely Place. He's a guy who, you would never have this language during the time when this film was made, but it's a guy who clearly has anger issues and it has ruined all of his relationships. And he falls in love with somebody, but you can see it brewing that he's going to destroy this relationship again. But incidentally to this really painful story, and I think this was his favorite movie of his own, every time there's a flat surface, somebody pours a drink on it. There is a glass of alcohol on just about every surface in this film. People pause, they have a drink and light a filterless cigarette. It's amazing any of them lived through the shooting of the movie, let alone for any time after that. And I just noticed that, I was born in 1963. I'm just at the edge of the era where virtually everyone smoked. And I worked for people who smoked. I spent many hours in a smoke-filled van going to a job site. But that, incidentally, after Prohibition was repealed, then two unlikely groups got together, religious groups from the moral side and very secular groups from the social science side of things got together. And that's why there are warnings on the side of cigarette packages. That's why even today in 2022, in an alcohol commercial on TV, you will never see them drink it. They'll pour a beer, but it cuts away before it ever gets to their mouth. And when I was a kid, there were no distilled spirits advertised on television. And I remember when cigarette commercials went away. So but those were two groups that would never have done anything together and probably haven't done anything since together, except to get the US Congress to require warning labels on cigarettes and to limit the advertising of alcohol. I'm sorry, Bert, you've had your hands up for a while.
I wanted to add to your historical perspective, thinking about the museum. Is it the Steinbeck Museum maybe, or the one that has him in it anyway, up in the Bay Area, that has a section on the Volstead Act, and with that same kind of historical perspective.
Yeah.
But what it says that stuck with me is that after the act was repealed, there was a cloud, a silver cloud that came with it, and that the amount of drinking really declined. It changed people's habits.
Yeah. That's a good thing. Of course, it gets repealed, like I said, in 1933, which is a terrible year in this country. It's a terrible year. The Depression starts right in 1929, but it doesn't hit its worst year until 1933. And that's the year everybody could start drinking again. You'd think it would have been the other way, Bert, that there would have been a massive return to self-medication, which is oftentimes what alcohol abuse is. It's self-medication. What about the general idea of temperance or restraint or moderation? Tad, please.
You're still muted.
Can't hear you.
Oh.
Hold on, there you go. There you go.
Okay. Technology. So I'm trying to connect dots here, and I don't know if they actually connect or not. If we throw away alcohol, Cliff made me read a book called Dreamland about the opioid epidemic. 100,000 people a year are dying now from, and I go back to what you said earlier about the Industrial Revolution, that despair. You know, they're calling these deaths of despair now. And I guess the third dot I'm trying to connect is when you talked about evangelism, one of the things I find so sad is so many people in the country think life is terrible. And by virtually any metric, it's never been better. You know, so how do we, how do we counteract the despair? Some of these problems would go away. It's easier to be temperate when you're not desperate.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, and the thing is, I agree with you about today, but it's hard to overstate how awful it was for the first century of American industrial workers. It really is it's an awful life expectancy in this country for urban men born in cities. If they were born in the city and worked in manufacturing, their life expectancy was in the 50s.
Well, I agree 100%.
Yeah.
But the point is, why do people think they've got it so bad today?
Well,
you don't have to look back that far.
Yeah, I think, here's what I say about that. Oftentimes there's 340 million people in this country, and there are louder voices and quieter voices. And the ones that complain are usually the louder voices. So it may be that that's an outsized representation for how people really do think about life in this country. Obviously, if you ask them now, while gas prices are high and inflation is a little scary, and the other things that we see, I think people might talk about a fairly strong fear of being destabilized. But what is it? It's a consumer confidence index. And how do they measure that? By how many durable goods are purchased? I forget what the stat is. It's washing machines, cars, refrigerators, and something else that are, when those things are being bought, people are feeling pretty good about their lives. I'd feel great about my life if I had a washing machine here. I don't, but I will one of these days. But yeah, I think, Tad, I think that's a really interesting connection between showing temperance in relation to our real situation in life, and that to have a more negative view of our situation leads to intemperance because of the human impulse to self-medicate. So Jack, please.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking in terms of our pastoral life, of pastoral living. And I was always taught, you avoid the appearance of evil. And the short aphorism is, if in doubt, don't. So, I mean, it's not only in the pulpit, but I mean, it's the way you live your life. And until we went to Laverne, I never touched a drop of alcohol, even though I was in a fraternity. And I got introduced to, what was it?
Mariners.
Yeah, but I mean, what was the drink?
Oh, margaritas.
Margaritas. I got hooked on margaritas. But anyway, just a little thought there about, I don't know if you call that temperance, but.
Well, and I think being careful about how we're perceived, I think there is, and I want to draw a distinction between evangelicalism as a kind of a system or a way of doing things, and evangelism, which is the act of sharing our faith. But there is an evangelistic component to how we are perceived by people who are still trying to figure out what it means to be a Christian. And lifestyle does make a difference. Now, honestly, in maybe one of the different ways that baby boomers or Gen X or any of these other demographic bubbles along the way think about things, I tend to think that people sort of 40 and under now appreciate if somebody looks like they have a full whole life instead of walking around with a list of things they don't do, as if that somehow makes Jesus appealing. And so, but that's a tricky thing. I get that, Jack. That's avoiding the appearance of evil, as long as you're not saddling one kind of person or one gender with being the source of evil. I have a lot of respect for Billy Graham, but the whole idea that of not getting in an elevator with a woman because somehow his clothes might fall off because of her, I think that's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
And demeans women. Like, just from standing there, the guy can't control himself. Why isn't that his problem? So anyway, now you got me on a rant again.
Right.
Kathy, please.
I was just going to say that I think this idea of moderation we have to remember that it has to do with others, not just ourselves. That it really, what we do, if we eat too much honey, it's going to make us sick, but we're also keeping it from somebody else. Now, I'm not going to say that about alcohol, but our behavior, if we overindulge, affects others. And to me, it's what we do or don't do in light of how it reflects in the world and how we care for one another. And I wonder if that kind of goes back to Tad in talking about people not appreciating what we have because we're so self-centered. Many people have this narcissistic viewpoint of what I need this, not we need this. We need to share the wealth.
Well, that takes the internal and external and joins them together, right? I don't overeat so that there's enough for somebody else who doesn't have enough to eat, which incidentally is a prudent thing to do. It also is something that is supports a broader sense of justice in the world, and it takes fortitude to do it. Look at that. That's all 4 virtues that we've talked about so far. Fortitude being that whatever capacity we have to resist either a temptation or an impulse to do something that either hurts us or hurts others. And so that's where I think temperance, if we think of temperance as self-control, and remove it from the historical baggage of the temperance movement. If we just talk about self-control, wouldn't our lives, our households, our church, our nation be better if self-control was at least in the top 10 list of behaviors? I'd settle for top 10. I'm not selfish here. I'm trying to be prudent. But But anyway, that's this has been a weird journey these last 4 Thursday nights, because I didn't know much about these virtues before. I mean, we preached them a little bit when the text lands on them, but this idea of 4 cardinal virtues, 4 things that make us human, no matter what our faith is. And then next week to overlay on those faith, hope, and love. That to me is, this is a good Lent journey for, at least for me. I hope for you too. Yes, please. Catherine.
I belong to this group that several people on the screen will also belong to, and we have objects and aims that we say every meeting. And it was written shortly after the Civil War, and the language is rich. But one of the lines is to aim at self-control, equal poise and symmetry of character, and temperance in opinions, speech, and habits.
Yeah.
That's PEO.
Yeah.
Cardinal virtues, right there in PEO, right there in Aristotle and Plato, right there here in our Bible. They must be important. They're everywhere. Thanks for that, Kathy. Yeah. Well, unless there's any other comment or question, I think we'll close in prayer. Next week, there's no mystery. Next week, we're going to talk about faith, hope, and love as the Christian leavening on these other 4, for lack of a better term, secular virtues. But the technical term is cardinal virtues. They're like the first things we're supposed to think about when we think about our own behavior. And so we'll add faith, hope, and love, and talk a little bit about each of those. And you'll already know the greatest of these is what?
Love.
There you go. Yeah. So that's going to save me 10 minutes next week. And you. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for this journey together as we continue in this journey through Lent and look into our own lives and ways that we can be better prepared to celebrate the resurrection of your Son. Give us a sense of temperance and self-control. Give us some direction in our own lives and in our shared life as this church, for where self-control can make us healthier, more welcoming, and better reflections of you. We lift all of this up to you and ask for your blessing on our lives and work. In your Son's name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay.
Bye.
Shalom.